you know, tandem railroad gear was as popular today. I should have known.
We're going to talk more than that.
I should have known that David would attract the crowd. I'm Joe Burke. I'm the chairman of the Miner Institute, and I want to introduce just a couple of other people before our distinguished speaker. Rick, put your head in anyway. This is Rick Grant, who's the president of the Miner Agricultural Research Institute, and he keeps the dream of miners' Hearts Alive Farm going with agricultural research, demonstration, and education. Our speaker today, on the other hand, keeps alive the second part of the miner dream, the business and the company. His great-grandfather, A.P. Withall, was an important person in the development of William Miner's company. Later became the president of that company. David's father, Bill Withall, became president of the company, and now David and his sons are in the business. No one that I know of knows as much about William Miner's patents, his inventions, and his business as David Withall. He has just been a tremendous help in putting together this heritage exhibit, and we're delighted to have him here today to talk to us about William Miner, the entrepreneur and businessman. David, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Gee, I didn't expect this. I thank you all for joining me today. Joe wanted me to talk about William H. Miner, Mr. Miner, the inventor. So I plan to do that today for as much as I can stretch it out without boring you, and then I'd like to also talk a little bit about a couple of the newest findings that I've made concerning Mr. Miner and his life. I'll open up here with an introduction that I just wrote. Hopefully it'll get us started here. Historic information on draft gear specifications and how they would be mounted to a railroad car are scarce. The best I can find out is that in 1875, the master car builders at their 9th convention decided that some type of shock absorber was needed on railroad cars. The master car builders, these folks are the experts, or were the experts. Building railroad cars, accessories that would go on railroad cars. From the railroads, most of the companies would have one representative be their master car builder. To this point in time, the railroad cars just banged together at some point along the center line of the coupler, or what passed as the coupler. You really didn't have couplers back in Mr. Miner's day. That didn't come about till a little bit later. The first specification for any shock absorption was a 13,000-pound coil spring, 8 inches long. It might have been nice for the history books to tell us the diameter of the spring also, instead of having to figure it out. This was about a 5 1/4 inch diameter spring. Now think about a railroad car. And here's a 5 1/4 inch diameter spring, about 8 inches long. This was the shock absorber. Think of the size of a railroad car, even a railroad car back then. Not very much there. But things got better. In 1884, the specification was changed to an 18,000 spring, 8 inches long, but of unknown diameter again. My research said that should be about 6 inches. So this spring got 3/4 of an inch bigger in diameter. Okay, to stop these big railroad cars. Wait, it gets better though. Let's see, in 1893, the specification changed to a 22,000-pound spring, all of 6 1/4 inch in diameter and 8 inches long. There was still no specification about how this spring should be mounted onto a railroad car though, or how it should be used, how you attach this to any kind of a coupling device. It's interesting. You've got this 1893 date when they came out with this final spring specification, the standards group. In 1891, Mr. Miner had already solved this problem. He had designed a draft gear that would more than double the capacity of this 22,000 pound spring in his design. In fact, by 1893, he already had 2 patents that would have taken care of this if anybody really knew he was out there and what he was doing. Okay, the whole problem was not being addressed by these specifications, though, the master car builders have put out. Many people in the industry recognized this, and something had to be done about the problem. Millions of dollars were being spent each year on railroad cars. This was already happening before 1900. Think of this, millions of dollars before 1900. That would equate, I figure, to hundreds of millions of dollars in today's terms on repair of railroad cars, simply because there was no adequate shock absorption. That's not to mention what was happening to whatever was inside of these railroad cars. It was well known if you added a second spring of equal capacity, you could double the total capacity of the shock absorption. The problem with that was the springs had to be side by side, everybody thought. You couldn't put one spring behind another, because all that did was give you a bigger and longer spring and no increase in capacity. What served as the mounting area for springs would not accept 2 springs side by side. It was too small an area. Even if the area had been long enough, there was no real standardized way to attach 2 springs to whatever passed for a coupling device in those days. When actual standardized specifications first came about is anybody's guess. I think from what I've seen that they just sort of evolved as specifications somewhere between 1900 and 1908 is when you first started to see standardized specifications. All this is lost to history, though. We just don't know. The master car builders interested in couplers were no help either. They had problems maybe even worse than the draft gear people. Due to many deaths of men standing between and coupling railroad cars, the Railroad Safety Appliance Act was passed by Congress and became law in 1893. Back before there is what you know today as a coupler on a railroad car that grabs up like this, a railroad car was coupled to another one with an oval steel ring. Okay? And this fit into a pie-shaped thing on the end of the railroad car, and a guy dropped a pin through each one and just held it in place. Okay? Well, what happens when the engineer backs the train, moves the train out? Well, people are getting killed. So this is why Congress passed this, what did I call it? The Railroad Safety Appliance Act in 1893. It was a very loose and poorly thought out law, however. Most of the crushed death facilities stopped, and that was good. But the incompatibility of 119 different coupling systems, all in compliance with the 1893 law, was not addressed. And that law stated basically, you don't have men walking between the railroad cars and coupling anymore. Railroad cars now had to bang together and couple up themselves. Okay? And to release those couplers, you had to do it from outside. You could not walk in this area. You had to do it out here. And that's accomplished with a lever you pull that'll release the coupler. Let's see. So into this world of few or no standards comes our man, William H. Miner. Not only does he invent a way to more than double the capacity of existing draft springs, but he invents a complete system out to and including the coupler interface. He does not dwell on the actual coupling method between railroad cars. He didn't do couplers. People think he invented the coupler. No, he had nothing to do with that. But he does have an interface method with the coupler. Let's see, that's extremely versatile. So that's the world that Mr. Miner came into. Let's talk a little bit about his inventorship and what it takes to be an inventor. Sometimes it takes almost nothing. I'm sure that the person, whoever invented the hairpin, probably wasn't an engineer, and it didn't take much. But if you're in the railroad business, you better know what you're doing, because there's just a whole lot to understand about the engineering of railroad cars and railroad products. Toward that, in 1910, and I'll explain why I'm presenting this a little bit later here, Mr. Miner wrote a paper called foot-pounds. Now, what is foot-pounds? What does it mean? That is the basic unit of capacity of what a draft gear will do, how much energy it will absorb. And he had this paper copyrighted. I'm not sure why, but he did have it copyrighted. Let's go. And we can't get it all on here very good, but that's all right. I took all of these from original material and made the transparencies, so maybe some of them don't come out quite as good as they should, but I like to use the original material when I can. Incidentally, all of these papers that I'm talking about, all of his patents and whatnot, they're all out there if you want copies of them. And they're just free, just pick it up. If we run out of copies, there's a list with each paper. Please print your name and address, and I'll see that you get a copy if we run out. Foot-pounds. What does this whole thing mean? Like I said, it's the basic unit of energy absorbed. And you have to understand this, otherwise it makes no sense to invent products like this, or even try to design them if you don't know how much energy you've got to absorb or what you're doing. Load in pounds, travel in inches. You bang a railroad car into something solid or into another railroad car, and you're going to get little points, and you can draw a curve. And the draft gear, as it goes back out again, the pressure comes off, and you go back down to a zero. This whole area in here, this is the energy that's been absorbed by that particular draft gear. Any questions on that, or am I talking like way beyond you, or didn't you understand? Okay. But that's the whole point of that paper, and I just wanted to show everybody that, because this is the type of a thing that if you're going to be engineering shock absorbers for railroad products, you have to know how to work with these things. Let's go on to something else here. Let's talk about Mr. Miner and his engineering. Now, what this is was a paper that was discovered in the old files by one of our engineers. I actually see it was 1973 that the man discovered it, but it was something Mr. Miner prepared for his engineers. Bunches of questions, bunches of statements, some of his philosophy on engineering, and what he'd like people to be paying attention to. Now, let's look at some of these. I had this retyped. You can see how bad the original cover letter, what kind of shape it was in. By the time the engineers got done marking up these questions, why it was impossible to see much of it anymore. Let's see, which ones did I want to concentrate on here? the type of sophisticated engineering that he's talking about here. I don't know if this is going to mean anything to you, but he's talking about changing the internal shape of the draft gear that would sit in a housing. Changing the internal shape so you can change coefficients of friction, which of course probably means nothing to most of you, but it's just another one of those things that you have to work with when you're talking about a steel friction draft gear. Sophisticated, very sophisticated. Let's look at number 3. Some of the more of the type of thinking Mr. Miner is doing, and this is brainstorming. He's thinking way out here, and he wanted his engineers to think way out too. Number 3. Here we're talking about a completely different discipline. Ballistics, rifle barrel making, cannon barrel making. How can you apply these principles to making a draft gear? It didn't work, and there was really no need for it. When I wrote up my little thing here, the concept, it certainly could be used, and it's extremely far out thinking as far as a railroad product is concerned. But when you're talking this type of thing, rifle barrels, you're talking very, very high tolerance finishes, and 10/1000ths of an inch, and you don't need that for railroad products. You just don't need that kind of finishes, and it would be too expensive to do something like that. Let's see. More of these engineering questions here. Here's another one. This one really got me when I saw it the first time. Now he's talking about not making shock absorbers. Let's make railroad ties. And how about making those out of old corn stalks or old sugar cane stalks? You know, once again, this is the type of a thing he wants his engineers thinking. You know, out of the box, not necessarily within the confines of shock absorber technology. Any products you can make and you can sell, presumably you're going to make more money on. They didn't. This one didn't work. As a matter of fact, nothing else has ever worked except for wood or concrete railroad ties. And we'll revisit this one just a little bit later. This subject. This one I kind of like too. There's 2 of them on here. Number 15. Let's see, is that what I wanted? 15 and 16. Okay, 15 and 16. Here's pretty much his philosophy about engineering. You got a brain flows, use it. This is what he wanted his people to do. This was not a project for him. It was just one of his statements that he would have around. And here's the one that's going to really surprise you. Look at number 19. He's talking about people's heads. Now, how does this suggest to you a shock absorber? Once again, this is way out of the box thinking, but it's the type of thing that he wanted his engineers to do. I've talked to 3 different people in my company, and everybody had a different interpretation of what he was getting at there. My interpretation is that the brain is largely prevented from shocks by the skull and by fluid within that skull. So, is he already thinking hydraulic shock absorbers instead of spring? I don't know. He could be. A bag of water, if you bang it, that'll absorb some shock, but only once. Okay. But water, fluids, any kind of thing like that will absorb shock. The question is, how do you keep it doing it? Now, like I said earlier, I put these first 2 things up for a reason, not just to show people what Mr. Miner was thinking about, but there's been just about forever a ridiculous theory going around that somehow Mr. Miner stole the idea for his draft gear from somebody around Shays. Well, as far as I'm concerned, a man that knows how to engineer, he writes this foot-pound paper, a man that can think about all these different things. This man doesn't need to steal something from somebody. He just goes out, designs it, and builds it. Okay. So what is it that he did build and design? And I think we're in trouble now, Joe. This was Mr. Miner's first patent, October 20th, 1891. This is the original Tandem Springdraft gear. Two springs. I'll explain how this works later. Actually, it's 4 springs. Can people see this other smaller coil spring inside here too? Mm. This is how Miner got this bigger outer spring was your standard 6 1/4 by 8-inch spring that the master car builders had specified. Okay, so now he's not only got 2 of them, he's added inner springs to give you even more shock absorption. The question is, how does that work? Let me just put this down here. Once again, here's that old-fashioned coupling device. Remember, there weren't any coupler standards in 1891. There weren't until 1893. Here's the thing. It looks kind of square here, but inside it's kind of like this. And your ring would slide up in there, and a man drops a pin down through this hole here. That's how you coupled railroad cars back in those days. Kind of primitive, kind of dangerous. But I guess they did what they had to do to get the job done. Okay, let's take this off. And go to my model here. Show everybody what the underframe of a railroad car looks like. Here's the coupler. Do you recognize that? Just imagine that this is the center sill of a railroad car, or at least of a railroad car that has a center sill. Some of them don't. Let's get rid of the coupler. Mr. Miner did. Take this apart. The part that I'm taking off here, they call this the carrier iron. This is what goes underneath, and it keeps everything from falling out, okay? That come out. It did so nicely the other day. Oh, I gotta take the pin out. Forgot that, that's why. This was something else that Mr. Miner invented. Here's the interface. How you connect the, I better get the coupler back again. How you get the coupler to attach to the draft gear. And you do it with this key that goes through and into the slot. Now in Mr. Miner's first, not his first patent, but his 1895 patent, he first presents this. This is a concept of how to interface the draft gear with the coupler. And he used 2 bolts through here, rather than a solid pin. But you can see there's not much of a leap to go from that 2 pins to this is technology. Okay. Joe, why is it that what you want it to come out, it won't? Follower plate. This is a steel friction draft gear. This happens to be the model of one of his very popular ones. Now, actually, Mr. Miner didn't have anything to do with this one. This was later, but it was the A22XL. It was one of our best sellers ever. The yoke that goes around the draft gear, and the coupler shank goes in there, and this is how you interface the draft gear and the coupler, okay? Even though Mr. Miner had nothing to do with couplers, he really invented this interface. And it's a pretty simple idea. There's nothing really that big a deal about it, but it's the first one. And he never patented it either. It was just one of those things that seemed obvious to him, so that's the way he did it. Okay, Mr. Miner made yokes too. We'll talk about that shortly. Okay. We'll just put this stuff over here, as long as it's flowing all over the place. let's explain how his tandem spring draft gear works. Okay, Mr. Miner basically worked with the tandem spring draft gear during most of his life. He did get involved with steel friction gears. What's the difference? What do we get here? This is just a schematic, but I think it'll show us what we gotta see. A little better. With the tandem spring draft gear, it's strictly a spring gear. No friction elements, okay? A steel friction draft gear, you've got shoes, wedges, and springs inside. You've got friction along these surfaces and down inside. I'll pass this along. The advantage of this 5-6-fold increase in capacity by introducing friction over just straight springs. But like I say, Mr. Miner basically didn't work with the steel friction gears. The tandem spring was his baby. So how does this work? Bring this back up again. This area, all of this, and likewise down on the bottom, that's the sides of your pocket, or what you call the pocket, the sides of the center frame, okay? He designs pieces, this going through here, all the way over to here, is one piece. You've got the same thing down on the bottom. You bolt these to the side frame, okay? What this does now, you've taken one big area in here and you've made two compartments on it. See, these are isolated. Does everybody understand that? What I'm talking about? Okay. You don't have one area, you've got two smaller areas. But that's what you need. You can't have two springs going right together. All that does is give you one big long spring. You don't get any increase in capacity of the shock absorption of the draft gear. Now, you've got two separate areas, even though they're one behind the other. And they'll fit into what the older railroad cars. You've got two areas and two separate springs. Now you've doubled the capacity of this 6 1/4 by 8 inch spring. Okay. Let's see. That was the best way to explain this. Then, how do you activate this system? You've got the yoke. And in this tandem spring arrangement, of course, this is on the top now. And in his patents, he talks about pins going through here. this creates a nub that sticks out on the top and the bottom. Why do you need those? Okay. You've got the coupler coming in this end. It bangs against a steel plate here. Okay? But it's going, that force is also being transferred through the yoke and by the nubs, and it catches this plate over here. So what are you doing? You're moving these two plates like this. This was the principle. This is how you get two separate draft gears really in one area. You go the other way, the pulling out. The nubs on the other side grab the plates here and here, and it goes like this. Okay, this is a solid piece in here. Once again, it's part of these side plates. It doesn't move. It's part of the compartmentalization. Okay. Any questions about that? I see a lot of blank faces out there.
No, it's very clear.
Like you don't know what I'm talking about. Okay. Now, I want to show you something else here that's really neat. This is a life-size model of something called a snubber. I'll show you what this is in just a little bit. But here we're looking at exactly the same technology as a miniature draft gear. Okay? A miniature steel friction draft gear. What did his engineers do? He didn't do this one personally, but just to show you the versatility of this product, you take this head spring out and you pop one of these cartridges in there. Now you got more than, what do you got? Maybe triple the capacity of a single spring, or 4 times, by putting an actual miniature draft gear into there. This is the right shape. It's just a little bit larger than what that actual cartridge would be. Don't know if he ever sold any of those or not, but it was there. The concept was there. Also, if you take that out, his engineers, and Miner worked on this one too, personally, you take that out, now you put 2 of these cartridges in there. And you design yourself a special yoke that'll take that. Now, you're increasing the capacity of this product even more. And what was nice about this is that there were a lot of these cars, I'm going to show you that in a minute, that had this tandem spring draft gear in it. And it wasn't the best technology out there, but you could make it the best technology out there without replacing the railroad car by inserting these cartridges in there. So, as I said, that's not the best technology in the world that was out there, but it did sell. This was something I found in the files myself. I don't know who Mr. Berger was. I presume he was probably in Miner's sales force once upon a time. But this is fun when you start to work with this. You know, you design products to sell them. And how well did the Tampa Springdraft gear do? There were many versions of it over the years. He designed his first one in 1891. He sold his first one in 1894. They were still selling the Tandem Springdraft Gear in 1929. They were selling parts for it. There were cars out there still. The Tandem Gear and the H, which was another version. Look,
What year would that have been, Dave?
this was up through 1930, through the end of
When
1930.
he died.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of things that had to be accounted for, Joe,
Yeah.
after Miner died. Just a whole lot.
Right.
Now, what are you talking, 1,944,000, 944? But that's only the half of it, folks, because these are sets, and there's two to every railroad car.
One on each.
So now you're talking, he sold over 3,800,000 Tandem Spring draft gears for railroad cars. In other words, jackpot on his first try. That was a big one. Let's see what else Mr. Miner made. I'll keep that one because I'm going to need that out again very soon. What did he make and design? A little railroad car 101 here. What did Miner make? Here's a handbrake. Railroad trains have air brakes, and they're stopped basically at the engine. But you've got a handbrake here too. A man could stand there, he turns this wheel, and that activates the brake. Right here, this is a draft gear. Not a very good representation of one, but it is. Miner makes draft gears, did make them, still does. Let's see, here's the yoke that goes around. Miner made yokes. Let's see, anything else here? Remember when I started out a little earlier, I said that 1893 safety law. Here's the lever. This will trip the coupler. Okay, but you can see it's outside of the edge of the railroad car. A man doesn't have to walk in here. What else? That's the truck assembly for a railroad car. This part in here is called the bolster. Mr. Miner actually designed those himself and made them. Side bearings. I'm going to explain some of this a little bit as we go along here. Mr. Miner actually designed those himself, and he made them. Big snubber model here that I had used for the other example. That would be a product that went in here to replace these springs. This product didn't come along, the snubber, until actually quite a long time after Mr. Miner was dead. Let's see. I guess that's it. Here's kind of a crazy one. A self-centering device for railroad car couplers. Mr. Miner designed that himself. patents there. It was a 1906 patent. Why did you need to have a centering device for couplers? Well, if they got out of line, they bypass. They don't couple up, okay? Really, I'm not sure, and I don't know that anybody else in my office is sure what the whole point of that was, because couplers just don't do that. The railroad cars in this area in particular are designed today so the couplers can't get that far out of alignment. But apparently back in those days, it was a problem. You know what, I should probably turn that. That's actually the way it worked. We're really not sure how this device worked that Mr. Miner designed. But anyway, I guess if the coupler got over too far, you'd wind up with you know, this up too far, and it would slide back down into the valley again. And that's how the coupler wound up being centered up. Joe, you look perplexed.
No, what other gear other than the Tandem Gear did he really sell a lot of?
We'll get to that. We're gonna look at this. He did sell some of these centering devices. You know, 1,500 sets. That's 3,000 pieces. There's once again, this is you double this. A well-engineered product, but not one that's sold. I said we were going to revisit the railroad tie thing. Here's a design by Mr. Miner that he did with John O'Connor, one of his engineers, a metal, steel, and wood block. This is a railroad tie. Here's the rails. So you're looking end on to the rails sitting up here. This was another one of his inventions. Not everything was a jackpot, as you can see from the previous. This one, as best we can tell, he never sold the first one. A good idea, but no one has ever sold anything but wood or concrete railroad ties. And
they do have some steel railroad ties.
They got some now?
I mean, they had some a long time ago.
Well,
it's a double rail. It looks like a railroad rail, but it's a double rail.
Okay. So actually, somebody did design one.
Apparently so, sometime or other.
Huh, okay. I didn't know that. Thank you for the information.
Yeah, they had them in the railroad yard.
You know about concrete ties, then?
I live right next to a railroad track.
Okay. Remember I showed you the Bolster. Here's another one of Mr. Miner's patents. He designed a bolster, his own bolster. Not one of his other engineers. He just did this one himself. Another one of his products. You can see he's thinking in a lot of different areas, not just shock absorbers and normal cars. He's out there, you know, in the forefront, thinking of anything that he can design and sell because he's a good engineer. He was a good engineer.
But while he's doing all this, he's out on the road selling and running this company, right?
Oh, sure. 1910. He's around here a lot in 1910 too.
Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely. Let's see what I do. That's the Bolster. Well, I won't put this up there because he didn't sell it. Like I say, not everything was a success. A good engineer, but not everything was a success. Never sold the first one. Here's a neat one.
Did it sell?
This, no. But this is a bumper to stop railroad cars at the end of a track. You come to the end of the track, okay, you don't want to derail and run the railroad car off. Now, when you're talking about something like this, and you look at the design, folks, this is a brick outhouse. I mean, this is really built. Concrete, steel reinforcing plates in there. And instead of just having the railroad car bang up against something, he puts a draft gear in here. Okay? So you don't break anything. He didn't sell any, but I don't know that he intended to. Because 3 months later, after he had this patented, he receives another patent. And this is a patent for an inclined test track to test railroad cars. Does this look somewhat familiar?
Yeah.
Huh? Except now the draft gear is not in there. He puts it out here. But this looks to me like this is just what he had in mind. For some reason, he thought this should be patented. This is part of the measuring and reporting device. Probably the amount of force is being reported on this round graph. And I don't know where he's reporting the travel of the draft gear. Remember, I had 2 axes on that chart before. You got to measure the travel of the draft gear, how far you squeeze it, and you measure the force that you put onto that. Of course, here's a railroad car here. That's at the point of impact. I have a couple of other shots of this one. Okay, here it is. You're coming down the incline. Here it just shows a section of track. Here's a winch to crank the car back up there again, however far you want to. However far you take it up the hill determines how fast it comes down, and that'll help determine your impact. And what they're trying to measure is the amount of shock absorption. And there's one more here. Here's your railroad car coming down into the bumper area. Another view of it. More of the mechanical instrumentation. We do all of this electronically, of course, today with strain gauges. And actually, you probably wouldn't even have a whole lot of electronic equipment around. You just run those strain gauges into a computer program on your laptop, and it'll pop out answers that you want instantly. Miner designed this himself, for their own use. Just recently, we discovered some more movies. There's a 1929 production movie out there on one of his draft gears. We just discovered some more in our files of an old test track. Cars coming down an old test track and impacting. That may be this. What he got the patent on. We're not sure yet. It remains to be seen. We've got some 16mm footage of that and some 35mm footage of that. We're waiting to get the 35mm footage back from California. We can't show 35mm. We have no idea what it is. We've got to send it out to Hollywood and let them transfer it to something we can use before we can see it. Mr. Miner designed yokes. Here's the yoke. Don't know if this was actually one of his designs or a model of it, but most yokes are cast, you know, port steel castings. This one, why I showed you this one, is that this was one that he designed that you'd fabricate using stamping presses. Just a little bit different way of manufacturing. Probably a far less expensive way of manufacturing. We don't know that he ever sold any of that particular one, but they did sell yokes. Let me put that back up here again. Yokes. He had two, but these are both cast steel, so presumably he didn't sell any of this fabricated one. Don't really know why, but I'll tell you, he designed these too, so it didn't make any difference. 46,000. You double that, what does it give you? 82,000 approximately. It wasn't a big seller, but it was just another product in his product line.
Now, the numbers on the right, what is that, the companies?
That's the number of customers.
Oh, customers.
In other words, for the new style, he only had 37 customers, but the old style, 132 customers for that.
Were they profitable, David?
Well, Joe, you got to presume that everything he did turned a profit. You don't know that for sure, but you got to assume that he did. Okay? I don't have a whole lot of financials. Most of that's been lost over the years. I will present a little bit of that today, but really there just isn't much around. Okay, another product Mr. Miner designed personally. Side bearings. I showed you where those went on the railroad car. Here's the flat area. Boy, it's not focusing, is it? The flat area. Here's where the bolster would go up there. Four-door railroad car. Okay. This particular design is a roller side bearing, and it's got a self-centering feature, which is why the springs are on the side there. I guess you got to double focus everything here to see what's happening. But these two springs would bring this roller back into the center of the cage. Okay. Did he sell that particular one? I don't know. But let's look at the side bearings. 441,000 sets. Let's see. We multiply that by 4, and what do we get? I have that written down here. 1,700,000 or something like that?
Yeah.
1760, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I come out with about 1,764,000 side bearings. Here's a roller side bearing. Here's a gravity roller. I don't know whether the one I showed you, if it's any of those. It could be. Positively, Miner designed this one. I didn't bring that one out just because I used the other one as an example of one that he personally designed. But we know that he designed this one. David, how many personal patents did Mr. Miner alone?
The count on my CD was 87 patents. And all different things, Joe. like I say, I'm talking about these are personal patents. These are things that he designed himself. So the side bearings, those were a great seller. Once again, there's the jackpot. And let's look at this last one here. This was a hand brake that Mr. Miner designed. Now, I'll tell you right up front, he never sold the first one of these. When this patent issued, he was 2 years dead already. That didn't mean it didn't sell, but he didn't live to see it sell. I think if you put that around. This is very much the more modern type of a hand brake. The older ones and what Miner mostly sold, you stood on top of the railroad car probably, and there was a wheel here, and you cranked it like this, okay? And there was a chain down there that wrapped around the big rod, and that activated the brakes, that pulled the brakes on, okay? This one, you can see is a vertical. You're standing on the side of the railroad car on a little platform, you turn it. The chain goes down, it grabs a funny shaped little bracket, pulls it up on this, and this activates the brake. This is very much a much more modern design, and also there's gearing and whatnot in here that you can get much more force on this by one person. But that was an interesting product. Uh-oh, what'd I do, Joe?
I don't know that.
I think I just burned out the light bulb, Joe.
No, I don't know whether we have I don't know whether we have another one. Maybe you can just tell about.
Okay.
Too bad he didn't invent light bulbs.
Yeah, like you say, Joe, I guess I'll just have to tell you. The hand brake, and there were several designs, the one that went like this, they only sold approximately 101,000 of those. It was never a very big seller. The vertical one, I don't know what the production figures were on this, but it wasn't selling, so I finally killed it as a product sometime in the 1980s. There's really no sense in going on with a product that isn't doing anything for you, except taking up a lot of space that you could be storing inventory that does so. Does anyone want to ask questions at this point?
What's the big seller now?
What's the big seller now? We're into draft gears real heavy, and we still sell side bearings real heavy. Lots of draft gears, lots of side bearings. Wish we had more products, but we don't.
There was a door fastener that showed a decent amount of selling. Is that still being manufactured or not?
That's an interesting item. What you saw there on that was for a refrigerator railroad car.
Right.
Okay, he made hinges, door latches, etc. He made insulation for railroad cars. He made door seals. He had really nothing to do with the designs of those. His other engineers did them. But one of our subsidiary companies, years ago, we got out of the railroad car business as far as making hinges and whatnot for refrigerator cars, and the end products. There just wasn't that much market for it. So we turned it over to our folks in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and one of the subsidiary companies. Now, what do? They take all these concepts, and they're now making trailer door hardware. Okay? In fact, we're the largest trailer door manufacturer hardware in the world. And it all stemmed from that product, making hinges, latches, and whatnot for refrigerator cars.
Talking about over-the-road trailers,
Over-the-road trailers,
40-foot boxes.
40-foot boxes,
Got a
50-foot
heat
boxes.
sensor on it.
You know what, I'll just turn that on. That will-
Now, does any of this reflect European sales, or was this all strictly done in the United States?
As best we can tell, the numbers that you've seen, it had to be all in the United States. There were some indications that he tried to do business foreign, but up through 1930, it just didn't happen as best we can tell. Nothing really happened on a foreign basis until well into the 1930s, and that's when my grandfather brought in a very nice Mexican national man, Santiago Mendez, and he was the one that got our international sales going. An ideal type of an individual for that type of work, a good engineer, a good mechanical engineer, spoke 4 languages fluently. Spanish was his native, English fluently, French, and of all things he spoke Russian real well too. I don't know why, but he spoke Russian real well. That's really when our foreign sales started. It was later in the 1930s, and it continues very heavy today. And there's some years when things aren't going very well in this country. We're glad to have that volume from foreign sources. Anybody else have questions?
Who was he working for when he made his first invention?
Who was he working for? Good question. I don't know who he was working for.
Would that have been Hutchins refrigerator?
Well, supposedly he was working for California Fruit Transportation Company.
Right.
But I've got a little problem with that because I pick up the 1895 edition, maybe it was 1896, one or the other, of the Car Builder Cyclopedia. This was the publication put out every 3 years by the master car builders. In there, William H. Miner is listed as being the master car builder for Hutchins. He's supposed to be working for the California Fruit Transportation Company, but what the histories tell him. I don't know.
Well, Hutchins made the
Well, no,
cars.
he had a financial interest in it, Joe, but he did not run that.
Ah.
There were 2 other people that were heavily involved in running that company. I've got all that in my records. I did not bring it with me today.
Yeah.
Didn't think the question would come up, but who was he working for? Well, one or the other, probably, but I don't know which.
He was also selling his gear at this time.
Well, by 1894, he was working for himself, too,
Yeah.
of course. He was out promoting his own product. So,
Does the company still fund or subsidize the research facility or this minor institute, or are they 2 separate entities today?
No.
or what?
Oh, that's a separate. The foundation's totally separate, and that occurred in
1970.
70. Because of tax laws, you had to separate the business organization from the foundation. But the foundation,
Foundations couldn't own 100% of anything.
I mean, company. So, but the foundation supports the institute and also gives money to the Shazy Rural Central School and to Physicians Hospital. Excuse me, David, the business. How about the?
Business, what about the business?
Yeah, well, how is he as a businessman? I mean, as you pointed out, he's really an engineer, thinks out of the box.
Well, he obviously had to be an awfully good businessman. He had a fortune built up before too long, fortune in dollars. That came from somewhere. You look at some of his correspondence, you know yourself, he demanded an awful lot of people, his subordinates.
You wouldn't want to work for him, huh?
No, I don't know. He just expected you to put in a day's work, I think. he expects you to think. In other words, he expected you to do your job. So what else can I say about it?
I just marvel about it. I mean, all of it. Here's, as you point out, those questions. I mean, they really were philosophical as well as engineering, and yet he's traveling all around the country, selling his gear, running this company, building Hearts of Life Farm. He's doing this all at the same time.
And of course, he had to do that. The only way he could do it is he had good staff.
Right. But he didn't have much staff, as you
No,
point.
he didn't have a whole lot of staff. He certainly did not. I believe I've got a 1909 or 1910 roster of employees. There's only about 25, 30 people in the whole company. That's about all we had.
But you'll see in the Hearts of Light, he had 800 employees here at one time, but here's his company. That was a little later, but here's his company.
Well, if he's only got 25 employees, did he sub out his manufacturing? Obviously, his stuff had to be manufactured.
No, he did not. Well, yes, he did in the sense that Miner did not make anything in the Chicago offices or the Chicago test facilities. Everything, yes, was made by somebody else. Once upon a time, most of his castings and forgings came from National Steel Castings, which in that particular era was right around the Chicago area. He used American Steel Foundries, which was right around the Chicago area too.
But it still has to be assembled. And
They were all assembled right there, except in the very earliest days, his steel friction draft gears. All the forgings and castings were made at the foundry, but they were assembled at the Withall Car Company in Chicago. That's where my grandfather met Mr. Miner the first time. My grandfather was working at the Withall Car Company. He was a production foreman. Later on, he became the superintendent of production at the Withall Car Company in Chicago.
When did your grandfather go to work for William Miner?
In 1914, I don't have the exact date.
Yeah.
It's in the records,
Yeah.
but I don't have the exact date right with me.
What kind of a person did your grandfather say he was? Personable, easy to listen to? Or was he a good listener?
He was always very personable as far as my grandfather was concerned. Very friendly individual. He relates the story of in 1891 he met Mr. Miner the first time. My grandfather was 11 years old in 1891. He was delivering his father's lunch pail over at the Withall Car Company. There was Mr. Miner. He relates, big smile, big handshake for the little guy. You know, obviously Mr. Miner knew my great-grandfather too. But he was a very personable individual from anything that I've ever heard.
And what year was the Miner company itself established? 1891 or 93 or?
Well, there seems to be some debate about that. We have decided a long time ago that he sold his first draft gears, I believe it was June the 7th, 1894. We're saying that's the founding of the company.
Some people say 1896 or 1897. yeah.
Okay, well, Miner might have been working out of a suitcase, he might have been working out of an attaché case, he might have been working out of his
Yeah.
home. He was working for himself, though, in spite of the fact that he was working for either the California Fruit Transportation Company or Hutchins at that time.
Well,
he was working for himself. too.
Is the 97 date, is that when he opened up that office in the Rookery?
He opened up
in
the office in the
Chicago?
Rookery.
Yeah.
That's when some people like to say he started business, but really he was out there promoting his product. He made his first sale in 1894.
And you also have material there, the incorporation was in, what, 1924, or is it 24?
Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
I like to move on to a different section now, a little bit different here. I've got a problem with a lot of the histories that I've seen written, and I'm not gonna pick on anybody here specifically. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna pick on one of my own company's publications. Two items here. This particular history is from the National Encyclopedia of American Biography. This is Mr. Miner's history of it. The firm was incorporated as W.H. Miner Incorporated in 1923, and he served as its president until the close of his life. Let's move on here to a different one. This is from the history of the town of Chazy. Can't find it.
Well, they had a different date from when he,
Let's move to the, this is the Miner 50th anniversary book that I'm going to read from. In 1923, he arranged for the incorporation of W.H. Miner Incorporated in the state of Delaware to facilitate the handling of the business, which had previously been carried on as an individual. Okay, that is just plain flat out wrong. And the other one is misleading. And my problem with that is, well, what about the other two times he incorporated? 1923 was the last time he incorporated.
so he had been incorporated before that
He had
date.
been incorporated before that. He had been incorporated in Illinois.
Was that a tax thing, do you think, David, with Delaware?
Delaware, absolutely.
Yeah.
21's there. 21's Delaware.
So in recognizing that date, it really didn't make it a benchmark, it was just in reference to another form of incorporation.
That's right. 1903 was the first time he incorporated. And that makes sense. Miner was not a stupid man. He was amassing a fortune by 1903 already. You don't want to risk that,
With a partnership.
you know, as a sole proprietorship, you know, on something that might happen in his company. So you incorporate and you limit your liability.
That's the same year he came to build Hart's-Alike Farm in 1903, so he had a lot of money at that time.
Right. This is the stubs out of the old stock book, like a checkbook. You just wrote your stubs up and you wrote people's shares of stock. It's interesting, who was one of the stockholders in 1903? John R. Mitchell. That's his brother. Okay. Who were the other stockholders? John Mitchell owned 1 share. Alice Miner owned 1 share. Adcock, his attorney, owned 1 share. Mrs. Goldsmith, his personal secretary, owned 1 share. And he owned 996 shares. Okay? Well, it's his company, you know.
You could do that in those days, right?
Sure.
And they wouldn't know 1 share if they ever voted against him, if he ever had one, right?
What's that 1 share worth today?
I have no idea. I really don't. For reasons unknown to anybody, as far as I can tell, he reincorporated again in 1910. Have I got the date on there?
Yeah.
There it is down at the bottom.
You know, these really coincide with federal tax laws.
I don't know about that 1910 one, Joe.
1910, I think, they were talking about maybe the, no, I don't know. Maybe that was 1912. Anyway.
I suspected that minor was incorporated long before 1923.
Right.
Like I say, this guy wasn't a dummy. You know, he's going to limit his personal liability. However, he can and insulate himself against any potential corporate type losses that would come along. And that certainly could possibly be a very logical source of some irritation if you had some kind of a corporate liability coming against you as a person.
Would he have hired people, I mean, or on a commission or something, to sell his gear around the country?
Sure he did. I don't think he had too many salesmen. As a matter of fact, as best I've been able to tell, at any given time there was Minor himself who was out selling, maybe 2 or 3 salesmen, but the rest of his salespeople were sales representatives. They worked for themselves. They worked on their own. People might have heard the name Diamond Jim Brady mentioned. He was one of Mr. Minor's best salesmen. He only had one customer, the New York Central Railroad, but he sold him lots and lots of draft gears over the years. Brady worked on his own. He was strictly sales representative, working for himself.
So Minor was not only the inventor, the principal salesperson in his company.
Well, I don't know that he was the principal salesperson, Joe, but certainly he was out there on the road.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of evidence to that in the files.
Yeah.
Just a lot of it. Okay. Now, here's where everybody's going to say, what is this harebrained guy talking about? I said it already, Minor made a fortune in his life. He made several fortunes, right? Does anybody disagree with that? Huh? Probably won't. But then again, you come across something like this. And here's total contradiction. These are numbers that I gleaned from the corporate tax returns. From 1924 through 1930. This is a period when the income taxes had just come in. Of course, Mr. Minor was still alive then. If he was a multi-millionaire, how is he doing it when you're looking at $316,000 profit, $158,000 profit, $344,000 profit? These are not the kinds of numbers if you're putting all this money in your pocket in the form of stock dividends that adds up to spending $2 million on Shazy Central Rural School.
Well, maybe he's paying the president of the company $2 million.
Well, there is a lot that goes on between here and here.
A lot of it went here.
Minor was taking out of the company a number of dollars as royalties on his patents. And as a matter of fact, all the patents were his personally until he gave them to the company, and then he collected royalties on those patents personally. The problem with this is I don't know how extensive that was. The royalties are there, you see some royalty numbers, but there's other things that are in those royalty numbers. So I don't know that he was getting all of those.
For that those gross sales and that profit for that time, David, there's something's coming out. You also said that he may have had interest in other companies which
Yeah.
don't show up.
Well, of course, now you look at this, and these are tax returns. Now, this could be a total work of fiction by Henry Schulte, his accountant. You know, not that they would lie, but you know, there's certainly always that possibility. I look at these percentages. I actually did these and calculated those myself. Those are typical of what we find today for net profit margins.
But they should have been higher.
They should have been a lot higher, I'm thinking,
Yeah.
for him to accumulate all these millions of dollars. Well, okay. Where's he getting his money? Sure, he's getting some here. He had another little company called Enterprise. It made discharge gates for railroad cars. What's a discharge gate? You've got a covered hopper car, completely enclosed, something that's carrying wheat, something that's carrying corn. You look and you've got 3 cone-shaped things on the bottom that stick out the bottom, and on the bottom there's a discharge gate. You crank these open and the product will come out. Mr. Miner had a company that made this type of thing. They made ballast gates for ballast cars to put the stone around the track. A very profitable company. Some people have said, legend has it, that it was even more profitable than Miner. I don't know this. All the financials are long gone. They're just lost. He could have been making a lot of money there, Joe, taking it out. But
because $4 million, what, in 1916 for Shazy's school, and we looked at, I think, for inflation, and we figured that we're talking $30 million anyway. So hospital, 1924, $6 million. So we're talking $45 million.
these kinds of numbers are generating that, guys.
Yeah, you know, and how do you put that together with this?
It doesn't compute at all. So I've been looking around for a few other things. Does he have some other sources of income? Well, maybe. I thought I had my sights set on one. It was called the W.H. Miner Publishing Company.
Nobody ever made any money publishing.
Well, I don't know, Joe. And Linda, wherever you are, I thank you for giving me that information with 46 different W.H. miners on it. That made sure that, you know, I had a 1 in 46 chance that this was the right W.H. Miner. It turns out it wasn't. That was William Harvey Miner, who was in the publishing business. I have no idea who William Harvey Miner was. He was probably successful. There were a lot of successful men named Miner in the country right about then. But I think some of the answers to some of my questions came one day in February this year when 2 of my staff, my patent attorney, John Charley, and the administrative head of my engineering department come into my office. And these 2 gentlemen have smiles on them, you know, just about out to here. In fact, if they'd have had any bigger smiles, they'd have had to walk through the door sideways because they wouldn't have fit. And I'm figuring these 2 guys have found where Mr. Miner had his Tandem Springdrafters made. And absolutely not. They start talking about Mr. Miner's gold mine. I know, Joe. It sounds harebrained.
You couldn't say that in a book, nobody believe it.
Well, here it is, though. Not only that, Joe, here's how they found it. Look down here. Drawing number 2431.
1906?
Right. Drawing 2431 is a minor drawing number. The 2 guys found this in the minor engineering files. And
There's gold in them there company. Oh my gosh.
here's the drawing number 2430. These are drawings of the claims of a gold mine. Not only of one gold mine, but there's several gold mines in this plot. Fred, you're over there smiling. I know, it's harebrained.
Now,
Fred.
what's the date on that again?
It's 1906.
1906.
St. Patty's Day, March 17th. It was a leprechaun that found it.
Yeah, it must have been.
But here you are, and you know what? He was involved in gold mines. And I will show you. Even as late as 1962, here, these 4 stacks originally belonged to Mr. Miner personally. Jim Butler Mining Company, Tonopah Belmont Development Company, West End Consolidated Mines Corporation, West End Opateka Mines. These are all gold mines.
Was that would have been part of the, well, the company and the foundation were together then, huh? Yeah. That's interesting. It's fascinating. Yeah.
Now, this doesn't look like a whole lot of shares. Well, wait till you see this. This is going to blow your socks off. This one goes back a little bit further. This is 1935. Miss Back had received a dividend check from one of these gold mines. She didn't quite know what to do with it. Here's the pertinent information down on the bottom.
Sidley was his attorney, just so people know.
Okay.
Why don't you say just quick who Miss Back was?
You will recall that this stock was listed as worthless in Mr. Miner's estate, and therefore we never transferred it on the company books. Since then, transfer taxes of 4 cents a share have been enacted so that it would cost between $3,500 and $4,000 now to transfer the stock to the name of the foundation. This, of course, is prohibitive under circumstances. 1935, you're in the middle of the Depression. But at 3 cents a share or 4 cents a share, that translates to 87,500 shares of this gold mine. At the least, it could have been 100,000 shares. Well, how much dividend, was he getting off the gold mine stock? It was probably a whole lot.
We have no idea when he bought it.
Probably about 1905 or 1906. Probably got in on the ground floor. I don't know, Joe. It is certainly he owned it. He owned a lot of stock in gold mines. And I'm thinking that here's where, totally unknown to us, Miner was making money. He was making probably a lot of money on gold mines. He wasn't out there mining. He wasn't out there doing the engineering. He was an investor.
What was his net worth when the estate was finally?
No idea.
No idea.
Absolutely no idea.
You can't really tell from looking at the wills. David, maybe you could wrap it up and see if people have some questions. We're sort of running out of time here. Anyway, you brought out the gold.
Here's a question. I read somewhere that he was on the board of directors of AT&T.
Yes, he was.
Illinois Telegraph. He was on big
He was on a
companies.
lot of boards.
Yeah.
Western Electric Company, American Telephone Telegraph. He was the chairman of the board of directors of Pratt & Letchworth Foundry in Buffalo.
Okay.
That's where he had a lot of his product made.
How about the Lozier company? Not the Lozier,
That sounds familiar.
the car company that he owned, that you drove,
Pierce Arrow.
Pierce Arrow in Buffalo.
He owned a lot of them, but I don't know that he was ever part of it. No, I don't know that. I don't have any information that says he was.
Any last words other than gold?
I know, you're laughing at me, Joe.
No. I mean, maybe that'll solve the mystery that is.
Well, I don't know
plagued
that it
both of
solves
us.
the mystery, but it sure gives me a definite maybe.
Well.
The publishing company thing didn't work out, so he wasn't making any money on that. But he was certainly making some money in the gold mines. It's just that I don't know how much because there's no financial records left of any of that type of thing anymore.
Well, we really know he was spending it here, so we gotta know he was making it
He was
someplace.
making it somewhere.
Well, listen, please join me in thanking David, and I especially pleased that he found that gold at the end. Thank you, David. We have some lemonade outside, and no gold, but there are really some fascinating materials that David has brought with him, including the patent applications, which
I've got all 87 of his patents on a CD out there. If you want to take one of those. If I run out, put your name on the list and I'll get you a copy.
So thank you.
Please just print them.
Thank
so I
you
can
for
get
coming,
your name
and
on
please
there.
have some lemonade.
Nice.